Imagine you are a German sailor. You are thousands of miles from home, stationed on a tropical island in Southeast Asia. You are fighting for the Third Reich, but your neighbors, your base commanders, and your drinking buddies are all Japanese. You are allies, brothers in arms, the Axis powers. But then, the radio crackles with a message that changes the world. Berlin has fallen. Hitler is dead. Germany has surrendered. In that exact second, you look up and realize the Japanese soldiers guarding the gate aren't smiling anymore. They are pointing their bayonets at you. This is not a fiction. This is the untold story of May 1945, when the Empire of Japan turned on its closest ally. Today, we are uncovering the day the Japanese seized the German Navy. This is the story of the Monsun Gruppe. To understand the magnitude of this betrayal, we have to travel back to the height of the war and look at the map. By 1943, the Axis powers were geographically isolated. Germany was being strangled in Europe, surrounded by the Soviets and the Western Allies. Japan was fighting a desperate island-hopping campaign in the Pacific. They were two empires fighting the same war, yet separated by 15,000 miles of hostile ocean. Most history books will tell you that Germany fought in the Atlantic and Japan fought in the Pacific, and never the twain met. That is wrong. There was a secret, deadly bridge between them, a lifeline forged in steel and salt water. It was known as the Monsun Gruppe. This wasn't just a military alliance. It was a desperate exchange of survival. Japan had the raw materials Germany was starving for: rubber, tin, tungsten, quinine for medicine, and opium. Germany, in return, possessed the cutting-edge technology Japan frantically needed to counter the American war machine: blueprint for jet engines, advanced radar systems, encryption devices, and the most terrifying weapon of the deep, the long-range U-boat. To bridge this gap, the Germans launched the Yanagi Missions. These were underwater suicide runs. Huge Type IXD-2 U-boats, the sea cows of the fleet, were stripped of some torpedoes and loaded to the brim with cargo and technical experts. They had to leave the bunkers of occupied France, slip past the Allied destroyers in the Bay of Biscay, run the gauntlet of the South Atlantic, round the storm-lashed Cape of Good Hope, and cross the vast, empty Indian Ocean. It was a journey of 3 to 4 months in a steel tube reeking of diesel and sweat. But for those who survived the journey, arriving in the Far East was like landing on another planet. The primary hub for this operation was Penang, Malaysia. When a battered U-boat finally limped into the harbor, rusty and barnacle-encrusted, they weren't greeted by the gray skies of the North Sea. They were greeted by palm trees, tropical heat, and the immaculate white uniforms of the Imperial Japanese Navy. For 2 years, Penang became a bizarre little Berlin in the tropics. It was a pirate's paradise. The German sailors, known as the Grey Wolves, were treated like royalty by their Japanese hosts. After months of eating moldy bread and canned food, they were feasted with fresh pineapple, bananas, and sake. The Japanese built special rest camps for them in the cool hills. They shared quarters, they shared technology, and they shared a deep mutual hatred for the British and Americans. The cultural exchange was fascinating. German engineers marveled at the Japanese long-lance torpedoes, the finest oxygen torpedoes of the war. Japanese officers were awestruck by the German encryption machines and the sheer durability of the U-boat hulls. They drank together, schnapps meeting sake, and toasted to the eventual victory of the Axis. The Germans operated out of these bases with lethal efficiency. The Indian Ocean had fewer Allied convoy escorts than the Atlantic, making it a hunting ground. The Monsun Gruppe sank dozens of Allied merchant ships, disrupting the supply lines to India and Australia. Every time they returned to dock, the Japanese bands would play, and the flags of the Third Reich and the rising sun would fly side by side in the tropical breeze. It seemed like an unbreakable bond. The Japanese admired the German engineering prowess, the German efficiency. The Germans admired the Japanese Bushido spirit, their absolute discipline and refusal to surrender. They were the two master races of the Axis ideology, finally united in a tropical stronghold. But beneath the surface of this camaraderie, there was a transactional coldness. Japan needed the U-boats. Germany needed the rubber. It was a marriage of convenience, not affection. And in the brutal calculus of total war, A marriage of convenience lasts exactly as long as both partners are useful. As 1945 approached, the German sailors began to notice a shift. The supplies from Germany stopped arriving. The news from home became bleak. And the Japanese, ever polite, ever disciplined, began to look at their German friends with a calculating eye. The unbreakable bond was about to be tested by the ultimate reality. Friendship in war is only as strong as your last victory. By late 1944, the tide had shifted violently. The little Berlin in the tropics began to feel less like a resort and more like a cage. As the news from Europe turned catastrophic, with the Allies crossing the Rhine and the Soviets pushing toward Berlin, a deep ideological chasm opened up between the German sailors and their Japanese hosts. This wasn't just about losing battles. It was about how the two cultures viewed the concept of the end. For the German U-boat crews, warfare was a profession. It was technical, calculated, and pragmatic. They were elite sailors operating billion-mark machines. If a situation was hopeless, the rational German military doctrine suggested you retreat, regroup, or, in the worst-case scenario, surrender to fight another day or rebuild. They were fighting for a government. And if that government fell, the war was logically over. But for the Japanese, warfare was spiritual. The Imperial Military Code, Bushido, viewed surrender not just as a military failure, but as a moral corruption. To a Japanese officer, a soldier who surrendered was less than human. He was a ghost who had forfeited his place in society. The Japanese were preparing for Gyokusai, shattered jewel, the concept of glorious self-destruction. This clash of philosophies created a toxic atmosphere in the mess halls of Penang and Singapore. German captains, listening to the radio reports of burning German cities, would sit with their heads in their hands, openly discussing the inevitable defeat. They worried about their wives in Hamburg or their parents in Dresden. They were mourning. To the Japanese observers, this mourning looked like cowardice. They watched the Germans weeping over letters from home and felt a growing disgust. Why were these Aryan warriors so afraid of death? Why were they talking about after the war? For a true warrior, there is no after if you lose. Specific incidents began to occur. In officers' clubs, what used to be friendly debates turned into icy silences. A German officer might remark, "It seems the Americans have a logistical advantage we cannot overcome." A Japanese officer would reply coldly, "Spirit can overcome any material advantage. To think otherwise is treason." The Japanese High Command began to view the U-boats with deep paranoia. They looked at these massive, long-range submarines docked in their harbors and realized they were essentially Trojan horses. These boats had the range to sail to Australia or the U.S. West Coast. If the German government collapsed, what would stop a German captain from deciding to save his crew? What would stop him from sailing out, raising a white flag, and trading his advanced submarine to the Americans in exchange for amnesty? The thought terrified the Japanese Navy. They couldn't risk having their own allies defecting with top-secret Japanese data on board. The physical environment changed to match the psychological one. The Japanese guards at the base gates, who used to salute the German officers, were replaced by the Kempitai, the feared Japanese military police. They didn't salute. They checked papers. They searched bags. The guest of honor status was quietly revoked. German sailors noticed that their radio privileges were being restricted. Spare parts of the U-boats, once prioritized, suddenly became unavailable. The Japanese were slowly strangling the U-boat's ability to operate, ensuring they couldn't leave without permission. The smiles became forced masks. The handshakes became limp. In the humid, heavy air of the monsoon season, the Germans realized they were no longer partners. They were assets. And in the eyes of an empire preparing for national suicide, an asset that won't die with you is a liability that must be eliminated. May 8th, 1945. It was a humid, oppressive Tuesday in Southeast Asia. Deep inside the German U-boats docked in Singapore, Jakarta, and Kobe, radio operators were glued to their headsets. For days, the messages from Berlin had been frantic, fragmented, and terrifying. But on this day, the frequency cleared for one final, devastating transmission. It didn't come from Hitler. It came from Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, the new president of the Reich. The message was short, brutal, and absolute. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. Cease all hostile actions. Decommission your ships. The silence that followed in the U-boat control rooms was deafening. Seasoned captains, men who had sunk thousands of tons of Allied shipping and survived the crushing depths of the Atlantic, broke down in tears. Some stared blankly at the bulkheads. Others ripped the iron crosses from their chests and threw them on the floor. For them, the world had ended. Their country was occupied. Their families were at the mercy of the Soviets and Americans. The German commanders immediately began the protocol for surrender. They ordered their crews to destroy the Enigma cipher machines, burn secret documents, and disable the torpedo firing mechanisms. They prepared to wait for the British or Americans to arrive and take them into custody. They assumed that under the rules of war, they were now non-combatants waiting to be processed. But they had forgotten one critical detail. The Japanese were listening. Japanese intelligence had intercepted the surrender order the moment it was broadcast. While the Germans were mourning the death of their nation, the Japanese high command in Tokyo was in a state of fury. To them, this wasn't just a military defeat. It was a betrayal of the tripartite pact. Germany had quit. Germany had broken its word. Within hours, a secret emergency council was held in Tokyo. The Japanese admirals looked at the situation with cold, predatory logic. They knew they were next. The Americans were closing in on Okinawa. Japan was starving. They desperately needed ships, weapons, and technology to defend the home islands. And right there, sitting in their harbors, were some of the most advanced submarines in the world. Fully fueled, armed with torpedoes, and equipped with radar that Japan struggled to produce. A ruthlessly brilliant legal argument was constructed by the Japanese Naval Ministry. They reasoned that since the German government had surrendered unconditionally, the Third Reich had legally ceased to exist. Therefore, there was no German state. And if there was no German state, these U-boats and their crews were no longer the property of a sovereign nation. They were stateless. They were abandoned property. In the eyes of the Japanese law, the U-boats were now simply floating metal sitting in Japanese territorial waters. They weren't allies anymore. They were war booty. The distinction was critical. You can't seize an allied ship, but you can certainly salvage abandoned wreckage. This legal loophole gave the Japanese military the green light to do the unthinkable, attack their own friends. The order went out from Tokyo to all Japanese commanders in Singapore, Penang, and Kobe. It was classified urgent and left no room for negotiation. Secure all German naval vessels immediately. Hoist the Japanese flag and turn the crews. Any resistance is to be met with lethal force. At the bases, the atmosphere shifted instantly from tension to open hostility. The phone lines to the German barracks were cut. The electricity was shut off. Truckloads of Japanese Marines, armed with submachine guns and bayonets, began to surround the piers where the U-boats were docked. The German watchmen on the decks of U-181 and U-862 saw the movement. They saw the machine gun nest being set up on the dockside, pointing directly at their conning towers. They realized with horror that the Guard of Honor had just become a firing squad. The takeover operation was executed with the precision of a carefully planned raid. The Japanese commanders knew that a direct assault on the U-boats could be disastrous. If the German crews panicked, they could scuttle their ships, open the valves and sink them right there at the pier, or worse, blow them up. The Japanese didn't want wrecks. They wanted working warships. So they used deception. In Singapore, at the Siltar Naval Base, the German captains of U-181, U-862, U-219, and U-195 were invited to a joint conference at the Japanese headquarters. It was framed as a diplomatic meeting to discuss the logistics of the surrender. The captains, believing they were about to negotiate their status as prisoners of war, put on their dress uniforms and went ashore. As soon as the senior officers were off the boats and inside the headquarters building, the traps snapped shut. They were ushered into a room not with refreshments, but with armed Kempeitai officers. The doors were locked. The Japanese admiral in charge placed a piece of paper on the table. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an eviction notice. They were told they were no longer commanders of the German Navy, but detainees of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Simultaneously, Back at the docks, the physical takeover began. Trucks roared up to the pier, and hundreds of Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces. Their elite Marines swarmed the gangways. They moved fast, weapons raised, shouting commands in Japanese that the confused German ratings couldn't understand. All hands on deck, hands on heads. For the German sailors below deck, many of whom were sleeping or writing final letters home, the sound of boots thundering on the steel hull was the first warning. They scrambled up the ladders only to be met by the cold steel of bayonets. There were moments of paralyzing shock. Imagine looking at the man who, just yesterday, had sold you cigarettes or helped you fix a diesel engine. Now, his eyes are hard, and his finger is on the trigger of an Arisaka rifle. The betrayal was visceral. It wasn't just political, it felt personal. On U-862, a standoff occurred near the radio room. A German radio operator, realizing what was happening, tried to smash the sensitive communication equipment to prevent the codes from falling into foreign hands. A Japanese Marine but stroked him with a rifle, knocking him unconscious. The equipment was seized intact. On other boats, German sailors who hesitated were shoved violently against the railings. Their personal sidearms, the Lugers and Walthers, were stripped from their belts. Their daggers, symbols of their naval honor, were confiscated. The most symbolic moment of the betrayal happened on the conning towers. Under the watchful eyes of the machine gun crews, Japanese sailors climbed up the flagpoles. They untied the Kriegsmarine ensign, the swastika flag that these crews had sailed halfway around the world under. As it fluttered down to the deck, it was kicked aside. In its place, the rising sun flag of Imperial Japan was hoisted. The visual impact was devastating. The U-boats, the pride of German engineering, were now Japanese property. The German crews were then herded off their own ships. They were marched down the piers, hands on their heads, past their former allies. They were loaded onto trucks like common criminals. As they were driven away to internment camps, they looked back to see Japanese technicians already swarming over the hulls, painting over the German hull numbers. U-181 was no more. It was now I-501. U-862 was now I-502. The German officers, still locked in the conference room, were finally given the news. An interpreter told them coldly, "Your ships have been secured. You are now stateless persons. You have no rank. You have no country. You are guests of the Emperor. But do not test his hospitality." The alliance didn't just die that afternoon. It was murdered at gunpoint. The gray wolves of the Indian Ocean had been declawed, not by the British destroyers they feared, but by the very people they had sailed across the world to help. So what happened to the men? And what happened to the machines? This is where the story takes its most twisted and surreal turn. The Japanese didn't execute the Germans en masse, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. They had captured the hardware, but they didn't have the software. The Type 9 U-boat was a marvel of complex German engineering, filled with valves, pressure gauges, and diesel engines that were utterly foreign to Japanese mechanics. The manuals were in German. The labels were in German. The Japanese Navy had seized the world's best submarines, but they didn't know how to drive them. So the Japanese commanders returned to the German prisoners with a devil's bargain. They offered a choice that split the U-boat crews down the middle. Work for us, and you will be treated as paid mercenaries with food, quarters, and respect. Refuse, and you will be treated as stateless enemies. The German crews fractured. About a third of the men, mostly technicians and engineers, agreed to the deal. Their motivations varied. Some were die-hard fascists who wanted to keep fighting the Allies at any cost. Others were simply terrified of starving to death in a jungle camp. But the result was one of the strangest sights of World War II. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed German sailors putting on the beige uniforms of the Imperial Japanese Navy. These men returned to their old ships, but now under new names. The U-181 was officially commissioned into the Japanese Navy as the I-501. The U-862 became the I-502. The German mercenaries served as instructors, running drills with Japanese crews, trying to teach them how to trim the tanks and fire the acoustic torpedoes. But it was a disaster. The language barrier was impossible. The Japanese culture of rigid discipline clashed with the German culture of technical adaptability. Tensions remained high, with allies sleeping with one eye open. But for the majority of the Germans, the ones who refused, the reality was brutal. They were marched into internment camps in Singapore and Java. The irony was suffocating. These men had spent years fighting the British, and now they were locked in the same prisons the Japanese had built for British POWs. They were stripped of their rank. They were forced into hard labor gangs, digging tunnels and building runways under the scorching sun. The Japanese guards, who had saluted them weeks earlier, now beat them with bamboo canes if they moved too slowly. They survived on meager rations of rice water and rotting vegetables. They were stateless persons, protected by no Geneva Convention, abandoned by their government, and imprisoned by their friends. For 3 long months, this bizarre state of affairs continued. The ghost submarines, German boats with Japanese flags and mixed crews, prepared for suicide missions against the American fleet that never came. Then on August 15, 1945, the second shoe dropped. The Emperor of Japan announced his surrender. When the British Royal Navy finally liberated Singapore and the Americans sailed into Kobe, they were baffled by what they found. British commandos stormed the naval yards expecting a fight, only to find German U-boats docked neatly in rows. But the confusion turned to shock when they saw the crews. They found German officers, still wearing their iron crosses but dressed in Japanese tropical kits, standing alongside Japanese admirals. The legal nightmare that followed was unprecedented. The British didn't know whether to treat these men as prisoners of war or as illegal combatants. They were German citizens, captured in Japanese territory, some wearing Japanese uniforms. In the end, the mercenaries were arrested and treated with deep suspicion, interrogated for months about their role in the Japanese war machine. The men in the prison camps were liberated, but their ordeal wasn't over. They were shipped back to a devastated Germany, men who had lost the war twice, once in May and once in August. The I-501 and I-502, the last remnants of the Monsun Gruppe, were towed out to the deep waters of the Straits of Malacca by the British Navy in 1946. They were packed with explosives and scuttled. As they sank beneath the waves, the last physical evidence of this dark, betrayed alliance disappeared into crushing depths. History is rarely black and white. We think of the Axis as a monolithic block, a unified force of evil. But the story of the Monsun Gruppe reveals the cracks in the armor. It shows us that in the end, survival instinct trumped ideology. The moment Berlin fell, Tokyo saw their German brothers not as friends, but as resources to be stripped, used, and discarded. The Japanese didn't defeat the German Navy in battle. They defeated them with a signature on a piece of paper and a bayonet in the back. It serves as a grim reminder that in the high-stakes game of global war, there are no permanent friends, only permanent interests. If you like this untold story of World War II, hit that like button and subscribe. Did you know about the Japanese U-boats? Let me know in the comments below.